You're listening to another ambitious Entrepreneur Network.com podcast, the voice for entrepreneurs and small business. Now, onto the show.
This is Women in Leadership Podcast, featuring success insights from women around the globe. Now, over to your host, Anne-Marie Cross.
Hello, it's Anne-Marie with another episode of Women in Leadership Podcast, brought to you by the influencealliance.com, business building community for coaches and consultants who want to make a much bigger impact in the world with their message. Now, my guest today says coaching is a dance, not a date. And joining me on today's show is Claire Pedrick. Claire is a human who facilitates other people's thinking. She's a business owner, a mother, a friend, a volunteer, MCC Master Coach with over 11,000 hours experience. And she's also author of Simplifying Coaching. Now, Claire established 3D coaching in the 1990s to bring together the simplest and best learning from coaching to support people and organizations to have more effective conversations with an edge. She's been coaching for more than 30 years, and she believes that the essence of coaching is simple and that it takes time to learn to work that simply. Now, Claire's current focus is developing internal and external coaches through training, through masterclasses and mentoring. And on today's show, she is going to share simplicity counts. As Einstein said, if you can't say it simply, you don't understand it. Why being human counts, and small tweaks that you can apply straight away in your life and business. Welcome, Claire.
Hello, Anne-Marie. What a pleasure to be here with you today.
It is. Isn't this technology amazing? I'm about finishing my day here in Melbourne with a scarf because it's really cool. You're over in the UK. Your day is beginning and you're obviously got a warmer day being sleeveless.
Yeah, although it's cooler today. We've had it 28. But, you know, it's really funny. When I go into the kitchen, my husband says, "So where in the world have you been this morning?"
It's so true, isn't it? I'll often say to people, I start off in the US and then I end in the UK. And in between, there's a whole myriad of different countries and so forth, which is wonderful. I mean, as I mentioned in the introduction, you have been in the coaching industry well over 30 years. You are a veteran. And now, of course, you are supporting many other coaches to really master their craft. And I love the way that you say, coaching is a dance. I say dance here, dance, not a date. Share a little bit more about that.
I think there's a real danger in one-to-one conversations that they can all look the same because, metaphorically speaking, if we're face-to-face, we sit in those 120-degree chairs. Mm-hmm. And it feels like a getting to know you thing. And the challenge, I think, for coaches is that coaching looks so very like many other conversations, and yet it's so very different from many other conversations. So if you make it look like a date, it turns into something else. And actually, that's if you physically make it look like a date. Yes. So if I'm coaching you and I say, Anne-Marie, let's get to know each other, mm-hmm. then we get to know each other. We're here to do some good work. Mm. But once I've done some getting to know you, we're going backwards into your story. And coaching is future focused, and it's about enabling people to move forward and get new insights. Yeah. So when it turns into a date, we find ourselves heading in the wrong direction. And we need to go that way.
Yeah, so true. Would you say then the coaches that you've worked with, and obviously there's different modalities and so forth, that many of them being taught, and that's great. Do you find that how they're being taught, and it is a skill, it's an art and a skill, isn't it? And we bring our own communication styles and approaches to that conversation, to the relationship too. Are coaches seeing that a coaching relationship is more of a dance and not necessarily a date? How are we faring?
Well,
or have I just asked one of those questions that we could have the whole...
How long have you got? Yeah. When are you going to bed? So I think one of the things about coach training is that people are taught some really good stuff, But the more they're taught, the more they think they need to remember. And the more they're taught, the more they think they need to use it. And there are some real fundamental principles that I often end up teaching people who've got 5 or 6 or 7 or 8,000 coaching hours. And when I listen to a recording of their coaching, I say to them, does the other person know what you're doing together? And they go, well, I'm doing some good stuff. And I go, you're doing great stuff, but you haven't agreed with them that that's going to serve them and that that's useful. So there's some tweaks that you need to make to be working in partnership. And I think the big issue for coaches is that we have a fantasy that in order to become a great coach, I need to watch great coaches coaching and learn some stuff from them. But the measure of great coaching is not about whether what you see me do is amazing. It's actually about the impact it has in the person that I'm working with. So we're looking in completely the wrong place when we're measuring whether coaching is great or not. And actually, it's about whether thinkers think or not.
Yes. And that is so true. If we're looking at more of the art, the skill, the dance in itself, rather than, well, are we getting to the destination that is going to be helpful for the client, so to speak, for that person in that relationship? And if not, if you suddenly end up dancing somewhere else, but actually, is that what we should be focusing on? Great point.
And I don't know the destination that's going to be useful for them unless I ask them.
Good point. And I guess that was what you were asking them too, wasn't it? Is that one of the things that you've found out? Because there's different, I mean, and I would imagine too that whilst you have certain techniques, as I remember years ago when I learned, and exactly what you shared, there were some different steps, but then all of a sudden when you're talking to another human being, they don't answer in step 2, the response. And then you think, hang on a minute, I have to ask them step 3 and step 4. And it can, if you're following that linear process, humans aren't linear. And I'd imagine that it really, there are some things, layers that we need to strip off, the learnings to really help. Once coaches get that, do you find that they really, that their ability to support clients just starts to excel?
Yeah, totally. 1 or 2 changes can transform the whole of coaching. And the first one is this principle of ask them. The reality is,
2 words.
to be a little direct, I have absolutely no idea on this earth how to have a great conversation with you that will enable you to have new insights. I don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
So I have to ask you. And one of the biggest challenges I think that coaches have is that they start doing the work in the session without working out with the client. Well, I call the client the thinker, but without working out with the other person what the work is we need to do.
Yes.
And so coaching is about open questions and curiosity. But if I spend the next 45 minutes asking you about yourself, you're not moving forward. So in the end, I know a whole load of things about you, and you don't know anything about anything new about your own stuff. This is my favorite little online training tool. So we coach people with beautiful insights and the wonderful myriad of everything. People come up with wonderful things. We ask them a whole load of questions. They tell us all about themselves. Yeah. And at the end of the conversation, I know a lot about them and they know nothing new.
Yeah, that's so true. So that was 2 words, ask them.
Ask them.
What is the second thing that you said will completely change a coach's approach and outcomes?
I think the second thing is put boundaries around the conversation so that you know what you're doing together before you start doing the work. And then the kind of underneath part of that is keep checking in. How on earth, sorry, you're getting me passionate. How on earth can we have a conversation with somebody for half an hour or an hour and know that it's going to absolutely get them where they need to be without checking in a lot to go, is this useful? What new insights have you had? Are we on track?
Yes.
Are we still focusing on this, or do we need to focus on something else? So checking in it's my current little bug, because I I notice that very few coaches check in enough. And what happens is the coach takes control of the time and the process. And then they suddenly say, so we're out of time. Let's talk about that next week. And that's not partnership. So if the coaches who are listening today, if the one thing that you do is to check in half an hour, 6 or 7 or 8 times, but it's not, am I any good today? It needs, and you need to check in before you panic.
Yeah.
So in most conversations, there's a panic moment where you go, oh, we don't know what we're doing. Check in well before that. Are we on track? How are we doing? Is this useful? Where are we? What do we need to do next? Those checking in questions will transform your coaching.
Yes. And as you're sharing that, I remember some times where I was working with a coach and we were talking about something, and all of a sudden I had this shift and I would have loved to dive in, but because they kept on talking, it was like, and by the time, that's right, the conversation kept going. And by that time, there was only a little bit of time, whereas we could have taken it to the whole, because it's like, I've got it. I absolutely have, I've got it. So that is invaluable.
Can I offer another tip then?
Absolutely.
Look. Because if that coach had been looking,
or even listening too, if it's not, if we can't see.
Yeah. That you can look when you can't see. You can still look.
Yeah.
If they'd been looking, they'd have seen a moment when you kind of looked away, and that's the moment of the revelation, and that's when the coach needs to stop coaching. So look, and don't feel that your questions need to be complete sentences. Do you know, when I'm working with people on challenge, we listen to recordings, because listening to real life recordings of coaches coaching is absolutely the way to get them to really notice what's happening. So we'll be listening to a recording and I'll hear them ask a challenging question, and it might be the first 3 words, and I'll stop the recording. I'll go, my goodness, that was the most amazing, challenging question. It absolutely responded to what the thinker just said. Let's see what happens. So I'll say that was a 10 out of 10 challenge. And then I count down as they keep talking, and it goes 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, minus 20, minus 25. And the distance between the best question in the world and this very weak thing that's left because they couldn't stop talking is extraordinary. So they had all the amazing stuff there to do the challenge. But we just have to stop. We have to stop believing that what we say matters. We're catalysts, not teachers.
Yeah. And sometimes even if you are face-to-face or even on Zoom, sometimes the pauses or nodding can be all that's needed, because it continues that conversation sometimes too, can't it? Rather than you filling in and jumping in.
Yes. And you need to learn to nod so that it doesn't look as though you're about to speak. So some versions of nod can actually interrupt the thinker thinking, because they think you're about to do something. So I know this sounds mad, but actually,
no, I can understand that, because sometimes when you see someone going like that, you think, oh, they're wanting to, to have a question. But if you are a nodder, because I'm actually a nodder, and I do that because I've trained myself, especially for an interview, not to interject too much with, wow, fantastic, that kind of thing, because it becomes annoying for the listener. So I can tend to nod, but I could imagine that if someone I can see it doesn't sound mad at all.
So if you lean in and nod, it looks and feels as though you're about to speak. So it's about where's the thinking. So if you think about thinking as a ball, the processing thing as a ball, if I'm holding it, you're going to be waiting for me to speak. So I need to leave it with you as much as I can. So it's about who leads and who follows. All of these things, Anne-Marie, are really tiny tweaks. And so you can, I was talking to an examiner for the International Coach Federation about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And she said something really interesting. She said you can read a transcript of a coaching session and it can look absolutely extraordinary. And it can look strong and useful and everything. And then you listen to the recording and it's a fail because of the timing and the tone.
Yes. That can make all the difference. It can make all the difference. So then if you're saying if you're leaning forward, if it's a nod, you can imagine leaning backwards. You know, all those skills you can use when you're communicating, even with a team member as
Yes.
well.
Yes,
you know,
because the other one, leaning backwards too far, looks like approval. So, so I would say, wherever you are doing things that aren't coaching, really use your eyes and watch people. So, you know, when you're in an online meeting or even a face-to-face meeting, in that meeting, there are times that you need to be there, and there are times when you know, there's something on the agenda that's not quite in your park, as it were. Those are the moments to watch the impact of leaning in, leaning out. And there's a thing called, in social work, they say minimal encouragers. And it's about what's the least that I need to do to keep the person in flow without them feeling that I'm approving or that I'm about to speak.
That's interesting. And I would imagine then you could use that to influence because if people do see you leaning and nodding, they may catch your eye and say, oh, did you want to say something? So it may be one way that you can influence them leaning over or looking to you and speaking. But of course, in a coaching relationship, as you say, you really want to keep the conversation coming from the other part of the thinker, because that really is the coach, rather than you speaking all the time, is not the place you want to be. Now, talking about simplicity, you know, we've got so many sayings around simplicity, which is so important. But as you say, simplicity counts. If we can't say it simply, we just don't understand it ourselves. How are you finding that completely changes, even when we're talking about leadership now too, when we take a simplicity approach or a simplistic approach, how it can impact relationships, productivity? What are you finding?
I think there's power in complexity. So if I say something in a complex way, I can disempower the person that I'm talking with, because they will affix knowledge and wisdom and expertise to me that I may or may not have.
Right, yeah.
So Robert Fuller in 2004 wrote a book called Somebodies and Nobodies. And there's also something, I was just reading a book last week by an improv artist called Pippa Evans about status, which is in the similar field. But I think that when we use too many words or explain things in complex ways, we can disempower others. And if we're trying to be power equal, or as equal as we can be in service of somebody developing in their stuff, we need to find a different way to be. But this is a challenge, because we live in a society where knowledge is power, and where the acquisition of more knowledge is often seen to be a good thing. And I'm not saying knowledge isn't a good thing, but I'm saying that in a conversation between two human beings, we need to be human. It's really interesting, because I've had the privilege of hosting some podcasts for the Africa Executive Coaching Convention. And I listened to their conference. I was a participant in their first annual conference a few months ago, and there were people there from the East African version of their telecoms, so kind of mobile phone company, Safaricom, and they were talking about changing the culture in their organization. And they said the number one thing needed to change was humility. If we want to develop good people, if we want to do succession planning, we need to have a humility around us that actually says, we want you to grow and flourish.
Yeah.
So I need to be a human being with other human beings, rather than me be a somebody, because if I be a somebody, then I make you a nobody.
Yeah, that's true. And, if I think to having conversations with a lot of people, for instance, the interview that I did before you, Claire, was with a former neuroscientist, and she was specializing in AI. And I had to say to her, look, I have no idea of the terminology, so you're just going to have to go with me on this. And I'm quite happy to share that I have no idea, because it's not my area of expertise, but I'm very interested in learning. And I guess that's, well, because I've had so many interviews now, but I take the approach that I'm curious. I'd love to know more. And because I don't know much about that topic, I don't see myself as less than. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It also has to go from your own perspective too, isn't it? Not knowing something doesn't make you less than someone else.
No.
It opens you up to a whole further learning if you're able to go there. And it's an interesting thing because one of the things that I have found time and time again in this in this particular podcast is that as leaders, we often assume we need to know everything, and not knowing something. And this is even with the men. And I would be quite happy to say, I'm not really sure, but I'm willing to learn. Do you have suggestions? And that's what you're saying, isn't it? Be human, be humble.
Yes. And if you're the leader, don't assume that it's your job to fix. You need to negotiate with somebody. So I was doing a little mini training in an organization a few weeks ago, and the chief exec was there and other staff members. It's a kind of creative organization. And at the end of it, I just taught them some simple principles about conversations drawn from coaching. And at the end of it, he said, I now realize that I can talk to our programmer, because he said, I really have avoided one-to-ones with her because I can't help her. And he said, now I realize that it's not my job to help her. It's her job to do the job. But she still wants to talk to me because I can facilitate her to find a solution.
Yes.
So a tip for leaders, one of our principles in coaching is show the working out. I used to be a maths teacher. So it's show the working out. And that's important in coaching. But actually, it's also important, I think, in line management. So, for example, we're doing a lot of developing our own team. And the other day, there was a question that was going around between three of us about who should do a particular piece of work. And the question was, to me, who do you think should do it? And I said to both of my colleagues, let me tell you what I'm thinking. I'm thinking, if I do it, it'll look like this. If you do it, it'll look like this. If you do it, it'll look like this. So the real question we need to be thinking about is, what is the most effective intervention for the organization, both in terms of what we deliver, but also in terms of what message does it say about who does what. And what I'm thinking is, technically, person A really should be delivering it, but with the particular customer in mind, the people who will be coming to the event already know person B and have a great trust in her. So I said to my team, if I was going to make the final decision, I'd say it was B.
Yeah.
So what they said afterwards, which was really interesting, was how useful that was, because in the end, they'll be leading the business.
Yeah.
And actually, they don't need to know person B should lead this. They need to know, how did I get to that decision? Because that's what's going to grow them as future leaders. Not the answer. It's the working out that grows them. So if you're a leader, that's a great thing to do today or tomorrow, is to show the working out.
It is, because as you continue to do that, you're empowering your team to the point where they may not necessarily need to come to you for specific answers, because you've worked and shown the working out. Had you just continued to give answers, you're not empowering the learning, are you?
Yeah. And if they disagree, when you're showing the working out, they can see which bit they disagree on.
Yes.
So they can go, So our final decision was based on trust. Now, one of them could have said to me, I don't think trust is the most important thing that we need to be thinking about here.
Yes.
Therefore, I wonder whether it should be this person. But we would have been having the discussion in the right place, because by then we would have worked out that the thing that we disagree on is whether it's trust or experience, for example.
Yes. Part of that showing the working out and giving some, what's the word I'm looking for, some validation to how you've come up with a specific response or idea, some thinking, also will give the other person or persons some insights into, again, how you've come up with that, but also even some understanding and maybe, and this is my question, a level of empathy towards that other person, because you can understand, it gives them some context, doesn't it? And you become more aware of what's really important. For instance, if you had mentioned, trust is really important for me and how we deliver and so forth, then you know that whatever decision that you're going to say yes to and give support to has to have some level of trust. It allows you to build some understanding and empathy towards other people doing that too. Is that what you found?
Yes, and it allows people into our mind.
Yes.
It invites them, it welcomes them into our processing, because what makes good leaders is the capacity to process and to mull and to think about stuff. Yeah. Otherwise, we're creating clones. But if they don't know how we got there, then how are they building their capacity to be leaders in the future?
As you were sharing that, I think of two of my children. One's very direct and would give a response straight away, and another one is more going through the process, that kind of thing. If you're working with someone who is naturally more the person who would give a response, I'd imagine that what you've just shared is that show the working out. For them, it has to become something that they continue to do so that they become familiar with it. Is that making sense? So if they naturally want to dive in as the leader, go, because they're time poor or something like that, they have to set the intention that this is what I'm going to do moving forward, because I know it's going to continue to empower my team. Do you find that some people have to learn this skill or ability?
We need to learn how to negotiate with other people, how to work with us. So here's another one. So as much as I am very quick at making decisions, sometimes I need just to sit with it. So my strategy, which people have had to learn is very genuine and not batting them off, is that's a great question. Ask me again in 2 days. And the reason that I say that I say that when it's something that needs sitting with, and I will not then spend 2 hours kind of frantically worrying about it, but I just need to, it needs to be in my subconscious when I go for a walk or, as I'm waking up in the morning or whatever. And if you ask me again in 2 days, you'll get a much better version and we'll come to a much better decision than if you ask me to make a decision straight away today. So I've just started writing another book with somebody, and we're very different. And she said to me a couple of weeks ago, she said, we need to work out what the shape needs to be. And I said, absolutely. And you need to talk to me about what the shape needs to be in 2 weeks. Because I need to almost not think about it in order to be able to come up with some kind of insight about what we need to do.
Yeah. And I would also imagine too, the fact that you were able to understand that that's what you needed and to be able to communicate that. Sometimes if we're not aware of some of those breaks that we need, for you it's a pause, because even though you may not be, as you said, thinking about it, it's still mulling in the back of your mind. There's still things happening even though we may not be thinking about it necessarily. That's why I'm sure they've come up with that saying, sleep on it. And often the answer will come to you in the morning because it's settled, you're refreshed, and things have take on a new light often in the morning. But so number one, be aware of that and then be able to communicate that. Because if you're working with other people, in your case, you were just saying a project, your team members, a coach, and I love the way that you said elaborate or state the boundaries first and the expectations. And often when that's not done, that is when problems can arise, don't they? Because no one really knows. How do we dance? Are there any rules to this dance? What happens if someone oversteps, or if you step on my toe, how am I going to approach that? All of these things.
Yeah, and if my preferred dance is the tango, and you want to do the waltz, then we're going to get really tangled up, which is why we have to really take the lead from the person that we're coaching. Just picking up on something you said just before, I think there's also something as coaches where often it's useful for us to notice what we notice about the way somebody processes, because they may not have been able to articulate it for themselves, but we might notice a pattern.
Yes.
And we can offer that back. So I'm sure that those things I've just told you about me, I'm sure I didn't work that out myself. I'm sure probably somewhere in the history of history, somebody went, oh, it's, you know, I wonder whether it's really serving you to take these things away and then come back with them.
Yeah.
And then you think, oh yeah, because the last person we're self-aware about is ourselves. Often it takes someone else to notice for us to go, oh yes.
Yeah. Now that you mention it, yeah, that's right. Because we often are we're so close to the situation, we don't recognize some of those patterns.
We had somebody for dinner last night. Can I just tell you, in the UK, that is a big thing.
Yes.
He stayed over and we were having a conversation about something, and he suddenly put his head in his hands. And I just went, and? Because something had happened, because that was dissonant to what had been happening before in the conversation. And he said, I've just understood something that I didn't ever know before. He didn't tell me what it was, but my job was simply to notice it and say as little as I needed to do to acknowledge it, but not take over his space.
Yes.
And this morning, when he left, he said, my goodness, that was an amazing conversation. I still don't know what it was about. But that's good, isn't it?
That's right. When the conversations or the thinkers that you're having conversations with say, that was the best conversation I've ever had, and you're thinking, well, that's when I think when you're masterful at what you do, really, and often you may not even realize, there's just things that you learn and do just automatically.
Can I just tell you, the funniest thing is that when this happens is that you meet that person 2 or 3 or 4 years later, and they think you knew everything that went on in their head when you had that conversation. So there's an expectation that you know the narrative, and you don't.
No.
And you just have to find your way to navigate that. And not knowing the narrative is annoying, but it actually serves them well. So
yes, because otherwise you put your own kind of you add your own things to the mix, which is, as you say, your understanding or contexts and things, which really should not have any basis to that at all. Really, for them, isn't it? This has been a wonderful conversation. We could continue for hours. In fact, I think the first time we connected on LinkedIn, and then eventually we had our first conversation, we spoke for quite some time too. And what an honor it is to have been able to continue and share just a snippet of your expertise and your wisdom with people today. How can they find out more about you, Claire? What is the best way? I know that you've also got a podcast. Share a little bit more about that in case people would like to subscribe and listen to that as well.
Great. So the website is www.3dcoaching.com. The book is called Simplifying Coaching, which you can get on Amazon and other big providers. And the podcast is called The Coaching In, and it's on iTunes podcasts and other podcasts, most of the independent ones.
Fantastic. And of course, you've always got some wonderful projects on the go. As you said, you're thinking of your other book as well. What do you have planned for the rest of the year 2021? Any exciting projects on the horizon for you, Claire?
Well, the big exciting project, actually, thank you for asking, because this is becoming clear in the last few days, is that I have done a huge amount of work in organizations over many, many years. And with COVID and a kind of shift in focus, my choice is to simply work from my beautiful office here. We've just moved to the countryside, and I'm not planning to travel much. And so what's ahead is lots of one-to-ones with aspiring coaches or coaches who just want to simplify. And I'm so excited about that, because it feels like, I'm getting to the age where I want to give back to the profession. And to be able to do that in a way that really empowers people is just beautiful. And I just got a little message on LinkedIn when I woke up this morning. A guy that I've been working with in Hong Kong has just got his credential as a coach. So you just think, that's fabulous. It's just fabulous to be able to be a tiny part in somebody else's journey of them going. And, he's got years ahead of him of amazing conversations. So it's about legacy, isn't it? It's about passing on to future generations of coaches who are going to impact the world.
Absolutely. And I think now is a time where coaches really can step forward and support. There's been no better time for coaches that are needed now. Yeah. When you think of the grief and the loss and the processing of that, and having a skilled coach by your side to be able to help you navigate that through that, I think is so important.
Yeah. And I think even more important that in coaching, when we really refine our skills, we know how to sit with not knowing.
Yes.
And we're in a world which doesn't know. And so that capacity to be courageous and to be in a conversation where we don't know what's happening and we don't know what to do, which is what great coaching is. If we know what we're doing, it's probably not coaching, is my little thing. But there's
more than consulting, isn't it? If you're the expert kind of thing,
totally. But that capacity to live with not knowing in a world that's all in a bit of, in a big piece of turmoil, I think is a gift that we bring to the world that's very unique.
As you said beautifully at the beginning, and we'll end here, is when there's a lot of complex things happening, that is when it's so important and where simplicity counts.
Totally.
Ask them and get feedback from them. How's that going for you? And when you continue to do that and not tied, as you said, to I have to know everything, but rather being there and dancing and doing everything that you've said today, I think we'll have the deeper conversations that people need.
Totally.
To move forward. Claire, it has been an absolute honour once again. I've loved our conversation. Thank you so much. I always learn so many things when I have conversations with you, so I appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here, Anne-Marie.
Have a wonderful rest of the day.
And you, enjoy your evening. Take care.
Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye.
This podcast is brought to you by theinfluencealliance.com. Want to influence real change with your message by becoming known as a trusted authority in your industry while building a sustainable and scalable business you love? Find out how by accessing our free podcast series at www.theinfluencealliance.com/podcast series. That's theinfluencealliance.com/podcast series.